All day, protesters gathered in Jerusalem and other Israeli cities. They say it's not just that the proposed legislation would reduce judicial checks and balances on the government, but it would also rob Israel of its identity as a democracy. But pressure is coming not only from the protesters, but from right-wing members of the governing coalition. Hence Prime Minister Netanyahu's compromise plan to delay but not abandon the legislation.
We are facing not an enemy, but brothers. And I say we cannot have a civil war. This is a crisis that endangers our basic unity. This crisis requires that we all act responsibly.
That's not going to satisfy the thousands who say the government plan to curb the power of the judiciary should just be dropped forever.
We said from the start, stopping temporarily the legislation is not acceptable and not enough. What we demand is to throw all this legislation to the dumpster of history.
Amongst the demonstrators, women dressed in red after the TV adaptation of The Handmaid's Tale, Margaret Atwood's dystopian vision of a future where women have no rights at all.
The first people that will be hurt when our democracy becomes a dictatorship in Israel will be the women, because they want to expand, for example, the authority of the religious courts. And religious courts have no regards for women.
By sunset, rival pro-government demonstrators were on the streets. The far-right security minister has agreed this pause in enacting the legislation only if he can form a new national guard, the purpose of which remains unclear, but which would come under his ministry's control. Right-wing parties, including those representing Jewish settlers on occupied Palestinian land, had threatened to leave the coalition if Prime Minister Netanyahu didn't agree. This morning's session of the Parliamentary Constitution Committee descended into chaos. Opposition members tried to shout down government members pushing through legislation that would, by weakening the judiciary, vastly increase their own power.
The fact that people demanding to stop legislation because some groups do not accept the outcomes of the elections in Israel, I think it's the most undemocratic thing one can imagine.
Shame, shame, shouted the opposition. They're especially angry about the sacking yesterday of Defence Minister Yoav Gallant, who, pressured by many soldiers and others in the military, called for the legislation to be scrapped.
What happened during the last 24 hours is madness. They've lost their sense and they've lost their way. It's proof that this government has lost all control and is dangerous for the state of Israel. It endangers Israel's security. Our home is in danger.
Maybe the most surreal protest was by Navy SEALs, reservist frogmen, who, like other members of the Israeli military, believe that the government's plans are undemocratic. Tonight, riot police were trying to keep pro- and anti-government protesters apart. Netanyahu's governing coalition may survive for now, but the divides in Israeli society are deeper and more dangerous than ever.
Well, I've been speaking to the former Israeli Prime Minister, Ehud Barak, who's been warning about the future of Israel's democracy. Given Mr Netanyahu's law is on hold, but he continues to want to go ahead with it, what did Mr Barak think is going on?
If that's the case, it means that the government decided to keep this regime change through legislation that basically will castrate the independence of the Supreme Court. We are not going to agree to it, and the protest will continue until the government will be defeated.
You have been warning now for some time about the direction of Mr Netanyahu. Do you think he is changing, or do you think he is just being pushed by his coalition partners?
It doesn't matter. He is responsible. He is the Prime Minister. There's only one Prime Minister in our system, and he is responsible. There are questions in the minds of many of us. What happened to it? Some of the decisions seems to be totally irrational. Israelis start to question whether the Prime Minister is acting with proper judgment.
What do you think it is about this particular law that challenges the power of the Supreme Court that has brought so many people onto the streets?
Basically, in Israel, there is only two branches. The legislative and the executive are the same. The legislative branch already enslaved, so only the judicial branch remained independent. So if you take this independence by, for example, make it clear that the government will make political nomination in the Supreme Court, which will turn it in one step into non-democracy. And the protest, especially of the fighter pilot, the cyber warriors, those guys, 2/3 of them in Israel are reservist volunteers. So they basically say, we have a contract with democratic Israel where we are risking our lives, something bearing our best friends in service of a government that very often we question and do not agree with their policies. But it's democracy and we follow orders. Once it is dictatorship, even quasi-dictatorship, we are not there. We have no contract and we won't have any contract with such a government. That's something that Bibi cannot fight. And in order to create a majority, he made himself a prisoner to be blackmailed by those racist Jewish nuts, Michiganers in Yiddish, and they became member of his parliament. He gave one of them to become the head of the police and the national security. The guy had 53 indictments and about 8 convictions in issues that spread from anything, from violence to participating in terror, Jewish terror, not Arab terror. That showed a very poor judgment of Netanyahu, and he's going to pay for it.
I mean, you have been using extraordinary language talking about dictatorship, Jewish terror, racism. I mean, do you really feel that Israel is now on a dangerous path?
You know, the side which calls the best and the best sons and daughters of our people, the fighter pilots and special forces, to call them anarchists and terrorists because they refuse to serve under dictatorship. It's an old game of right-wing proto-fascist movement to blame everything that they are doing on the other side and repeat lies 100 times a day until it becomes quasi-truth.
Ehud Barak, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
All the viewers. Thank you.